They had underestimated him. They had dismissed him and treated him as nothing more than a foolish bystander, until he exposed a legal fraud right before the judge's eyes. Even before he had uttered a single word, the courtroom had already aligned against him. In that charged moment, Jared Calloway stepped forward. His suit appeared a little too worn, and his tie hung slightly off-center, yet his posture remained resolute and steady. He was not a lawyer, nor had he ever claimed to be one. He was simply a man determined to prevent his grandmother's home from being stolen by a soulless corporate machine that reduced people to mere figures on a balance sheet. Judge Walter Grayson peered over his glasses. His eyes narrowed as the corners of his mouth twitched in an expression that hovered somewhere between a smirk and a bemused frown. Leaning back in his chair, the judge tapped his gavel lightly on the bench. "Mr. Calloway, representing yourself?" he asked, his tone dripping with amusement. Jared met the judge's gaze squarely and replied, "Yes, Your Honor." A chuckle rippled from the opposite side of the room, where Bryce Sterling, the opposing attorney, was making himself comfortable. Sterling, ever the picture of corporate confidence, adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate ease. He was a bulldog of the corporate world, renowned for steamrolling over small-time defendants. In his eyes, Jared was no challenge. "This should be a quick win," Sterling muttered under his breath, exchanging a knowing smile with his assistant. Jared heard every word, for that was precisely the point. He was meant to hear it. Yet he kept his expression calm and impassive. He had been dismissed and counted out long before he ever experienced the bitter sting of being underestimated, and that was exactly why he was there. The judge sighed as he flipped through a file. "This is a property dispute, correct? A foreclosure challenge?" he asked. Jared nodded. "Yes, sir. My grandmother's home." Judge Grayson barely glanced at him as he continued. "And you believe you can argue this case against a seasoned attorney like Mr. Sterling?" Without flinching, Jared responded, "I don't believe, Your Honor, I know." A hush fell over the courtroom. A few muffled chuckles arose from the corporate side, but there was also a peculiar silence. A silence that comes when someone unexpected refuses to back down. Judge Grayson shook his head slowly and said, "Very well, let's get on with it." But Jared was not there merely to argue. He was there to win, and none in the room had any inkling of what was about to unfold. The judge's skepticism, however, was only the beginning. The true challenge would soon come not from the proceedings themselves, but from the man sitting directly across the aisle, the man who believed that Jared had already lost. Bryce Sterling, with his tie perfectly adjusted and a smug smile playing on his lips, regarded the courtroom as his personal playground, a place governed by rules, strategies, and precedents. He had crushed dozens of cases like Jared Calloway's before, cases involving men with no legal degrees, no prominent backing, and no experience. To Sterling, this was not a genuine legal battle, but rather a warm-up exercise. Judge Grayson exhaled sharply while rubbing his temple. "Mr. Sterling, you may proceed with your opening statement," he said. Rising with practiced ease, Sterling buttoned his jacket and stepped toward the jury. His voice was smooth and confident as he addressed the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple." Without even turning to look at Jared, he gestured dismissively in his direction. "We have before us a man who refuses to accept reality. The property in question was rightfully acquired by my client through a legal foreclosure. The law is clear. The facts are irrefutable. This case is not about emotions. It is about contracts, deadlines, and obligations. My client followed the law." A deliberate pause, followed by a slow turn and a casual shrug, punctuated Sterling's speech as he continued. Mr. Calloway did not. No, he nodded once toward the judge and then returned to his seat with his hands folded, as if the case were already decided. Jared sat unmoved, his expression composed. He had expected this overt dismissal, and yet as he rose from his seat once more, he noted the way Judge Grayson leaned back, arms crossed, like a man who believed that what he was witnessing was not worth his time. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," Jared cleared his throat, his voice steady and resolute. "Mr. Sterling is right about one thing. The law is clear. The question, however, is whether his client actually follows it." A flicker of irritation crossed Sterling's face, but Jared pressed on. "I have spent the past 6 months studying every case, every statute, every loophole that banks and corporations exploit to strip homes from families, and I have uncovered something crucial." Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow inquisitively. "Something?" the judge prompted softly. Jared nodded and continued. Yes, and it changes everything. A quiet laugh escaped Sterling as he muttered, "Oh, this should be good." Ignoring the snide remark, Jared turned to the judge and announced, "Before I begin, Your Honor, I would like to submit an official request for discovery, as I have reason to believe that the plaintiff is concealing something significant." The entire courtroom shifted perceptibly. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his earlier amusement replaced by a growing sense of gravity. Jared's gaze locked onto Sterling's, and in that charged moment, one word hung in the air, a word that silenced the room completely: fraud. The word smoldered like a slow-burning fuse. Sterling's smirk faded, and for the first time, Judge Grayson gave Jared more than a cursory glance. "Fraud," the judge repeated, his voice carrying both skepticism and, beneath it, a hint of curiosity. Jared nodded again. "Yes, Your Honor, I believe that the foreclosure on my grandmother's home was based on forged documents, and I can prove it, if I am allowed full discovery." Sterling let out a sharp breath and shook his head. "Your Honor, this is absurd, a baseless accusation intended merely to stall the inevitable. The property was seized under standard foreclosure proceedings." Jared tilted his head and with a steady voice asked, "Mr. Sterling, how standard is it for a bank to foreclose on a house when the original mortgage documents bear two different signatures from the same person?" A murmur rustled through the courtroom, and a few scattered voices in the gallery expressed their astonishment. Sterling's jaw clenched as he demanded, "What exactly are you talking about?" Without hesitation, Jared reached into his folder and produced 2 copies of the original mortgage agreement. With deliberate care, he walked over to the bailiff and handed them to the judge. "Your Honor, these are 2 separate copies of the same document, one from the initial filing and one from a subsequent modification. Notice, if you look closely, that the signatures do not match." Judge Grayson leaned in, scanning the papers. His forehead creased with concentration as he took in the details. Jared continued, "Now, I am by no means a legal expert, but I recognize my grandmother's signature, and that second signature clearly is not hers." The judge flipped through the pages, his expression transitioning from dismissive to focused. Looking up at Sterling, he inquired, "Mr. Sterling, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy?" Sterling cleared his throat and responded, "Your Honor, this is merely an attempt to confuse the issue. Signatures can change over time." Jared did not yield. "Perhaps," he said steadily, "but that second signature comes from a document filed only 3 months after the original, and if you compare them side by side," he pointed to the papers in the judge's hand, "you will see that not only are they markedly different, but the second one was signed the day after my grandmother was hospitalized for a stroke." A wave of reaction rippled through the courtroom, and even the jury leaned forward in rapt attention. Judge Grayson turned back to Sterling, his tone firm. "Mr. Sterling, does your client have the original signed documents on file?" Sterling hesitated, a brief, almost imperceptible pause that did not escape Jared's watchful eye. We would need time to retrieve them, Your Honor," Sterling stammered. A small smile played on Jared's lips as he replied, "That is perfectly acceptable. I'll wait." The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. It was no longer merely one of curiosity, it was now laden with doubt. Jared was not merely intent on highlighting errors in their story, he was there to dismantle it piece by piece. And this, he made it clear, was only the beginning. Judge Grayson exhaled deeply through his nose and resumed scrutinizing the documents. His eyes flitted between the mismatched signatures as his fingers drummed against the bench. The judge, who had once regarded Jared's appearance with dismissive superiority, now looked genuinely interested. Meanwhile, Sterling was already scrambling to regain control. "Your Honor, these documents do not change the core of the case," he argued, his voice rising in a tighter pitch. "The defendant is grasping at straws in a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. My client followed the proper legal process." Jared allowed Sterling's words to settle before responding, his voice steady as he said, "The legal process, while clear in theory, requires more than mere adherence to procedural norms." "Let me ask you, Mr. Sterling, do you even know from whom your client purchased this debt?" Sterling blinked in surprise, clearly unprepared for the question. "What does that have to do with anything?" he retorted. Jared turned directly to the judge and explained, "Your Honor, the mortgage in question was sold 3 times before it ended up with the current lender, 3 separate transactions. Yet, The transfer paperwork for each sale, especially the final one, is missing the proper endorsement. Pausing for dramatic effect, he continued, every time the loan changed hands, an official transfer from one lender to the next should have been documented with an endorsement. But look closely. Sterling, notice that there is no signature on the last transfer. Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Judge Grayson knitted his brows together. There is indeed no signature, the judge observed. Jared nodded emphatically. Exactly. This means that the last company had no legal right to foreclose on my grandmother's home, and consequently, the bank that did the foreclosure never actually owned the loan in the first place. A hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom, and the tension in the air thickened palpably. Sterling sat forward, his voice tightening as he protested. Your Honor, this is... But Judge Grayson cut him off with a sharp interjection. This is a problem. Jared took a slow, measured breath. He had maneuvered them exactly where he intended. They had underestimated him, laughed at him, and now they were no longer laughing at all. However, exposing the fraud was one thing. Proving malicious intent was another matter entirely. And that was the point where Jared intended to deliver his most decisive blow. Sterling's once smug expression had faded, and the confidence he exuded at the trial's outset was now visibly cracking. The man who had treated this case as a mere formality was scrambling to salvage control. Judge Grayson leaned forward once more, his tone sharp as he said, Mr. Sterling, I assume your client can explain why this mortgage was transferred without the proper endorsement. Sterling hesitated, his voice faltering slightly as he replied, Your Honor, I would need to confer with my client before I can make a statement on that matter. Jared tilted his head slightly and countered coolly, You mean the same client who has been submitting legally questionable documents in multiple foreclosure cases, just like the one involving my grandmother's home? Sterling snapped his gaze toward him and retorted, That is an outrageous claim. Unmoved, Jared pressed on. Is it outrageous simply because I took the liberty of researching your client's foreclosure history? It turns out that my grandmother's house is not the only property acquired under these dubious circumstances. With deliberate intent, he produced yet another document, a piece of evidence that he handed to the judge. Judge Grayson skimmed through the papers, his expression darkening as he exhaled slowly and then looked up at Sterling. This case is not as straightforward as you have suggested, he remarked. Sterling's jaw tensed once again, but before he could continue, Jared interjected, Your Honor, I would like to call a witness. The judge regarded Jared for a moment before asking, A witness? Jared nodded. Yes, the person who notarized the second mortgage signature, the one that I believe was forged. A collective gasp arose from the gallery. This revelation was no longer merely about missing paperwork, it had escalated into an issue of outright fraud. At that very moment, Sterling stood abruptly, exclaiming, Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This witness was not disclosed beforehand. Jared turned calmly toward him and replied, That is because I only tracked her down yesterday, and what she told me changes everything. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom as Judge Grayson studied Jared for a moment, before finally addressing Sterling. I am allowing this witness to testify. Sterling stiffened, recognizing that the situation was spiraling out of his control, but Jared's most significant move was yet to come. At that moment, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open slowly, and a woman stepped in. Her name was Linda Myers, a notary public, and her presence radiated a nervous tension as she made her way to the stand. Adjusting her glasses and gripping the railing with trembling fingers, she ascended to the witness's box. Judge Grayson nodded for her to state her full name and occupation for the record. Clearing her throat softly, she said, My name is Linda Myers, and I am a licensed notary public. Jared's voice rang out clearly as he addressed her. Ms. Myers, do you recall notarizing the second mortgage modification for my grandmother, Alma Calloway? Linda hesitated for a brief moment, glancing toward Sterling before answering, I do. Jared then asked, And were you present when she signed the document? After a brief pause, during which discomfort seemed to cross her face, Linda replied in a nearly inaudible whisper, No. The courtroom reacted with a mix of shock and murmurs as Sterling shifted in his seat, trying to regain his composure. Jared leaned in closer, his tone calm yet insistent. Then, Miss Myers, can you explain how the document was notarized? Linda's hands trembled visibly as she replied, I was given the paperwork by a bank representative. I was told that it had already been signed and that all I needed to do was to stamp it. The admission sent a shockwave through the room. She had just revealed that the signature was notarized without proper verification, a fact that rendered the entire foreclosure process illegal. Immediately, Sterling erupted in protest. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. She cannot verify the legitimacy of the document." But Judge Grayson raised a hand to silence him. "Objection overruled," he declared firmly, his tone leaving no room for debate. Turning back to Linda, the judge inquired, "Miss Myers, do you understand the legal implications of what you have just stated?" With a slight nod and glassy eyes, Linda admitted, "Yes, sir, I did not know at the time, but I should have." Sterling slumped back in his seat, running a hand down his face as he realized the gravity of the situation. Jared then addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, given the testimony of Miss Myers, the forged signature, and the missing mortgage transfer endorsements, I move that this foreclosure be declared null and void. My grandmother's home was taken through fraudulent means, and the evidence is now before you." A profound silence enveloped the courtroom as Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly on the bench. Finally, with a firm and resonant voice, he pronounced, "The court rules in favor of the defendant. The foreclosure is void, and the property shall be returned immediately." In that instant, Jared exhaled deeply, a breath he had been holding throughout the ordeal. Every moment of the fight, every month of relentless research had led to this singular moment. As Jared stepped outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the steps. He paused, taking a slow, measured breath. The air felt different, not lighter or freer, but distinctly real. His grandmother's home was safe, and that was all that mattered. A small crowd from the gallery began to filter out behind him. Their voices were hushed. Some whispered remarks about the case, while others commented on Jared's unexpected prowess. He caught snippets of phrases like "never saw it coming" and "that man should be a lawyer," but Jared cared little for such validation. What mattered most was justice, and today, justice had been served. Just then, a voice called out from behind him, "Calloway!" Jared turned to see Judge Grayson standing at the top of the courthouse steps, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. The arrogance that had once colored the judge's demeanor was now replaced by something more measured and respectful. Meeting the judge's gaze, Jared heard him say, "You surprised me in there." The judge's voice was neither warm nor cold. It was simply honest. Jared replied quietly, "You weren't the only one." After studying him for a brief moment, Judge Grayson offered a small nod and then added with a wry smile, "Ever thought about law school?" Jared chuckled softly, replying, "Not really." The judge smirked slightly and remarked, "Well, you might want to reconsider. You've got a talent for making people squirm." With that final remark, the judge turned and disappeared into the courthouse, leaving Jared shaking his head and pondering the unexpected turn his life had taken. In that moment of quiet reflection, Jared realized that the fight was far from over. His battle was not merely one of legal maneuvering or courtroom theatrics. It was a fight for justice, a stand against a system that too often placed power in the hands of those with money and titles. It was a reminder that true power belonged to those who refused to back down, who were willing to challenge the status quo, even when everyone expected them to fail. Jared had proven that the underestimated, the dismissed, and the ignored could rise above and change the very fabric of a corrupt system. And if anyone ever tried to take what was rightfully his again, they would have to face a man who was unafraid to fight back. The day's events would be remembered not just as a courtroom victory, but as a defining moment in the struggle for fairness. A moment when one man's determination exposed the hidden flaws of a system that treated people as nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. For Jared Calloway, the case was about so much more than saving a home. It was about ensuring that justice prevailed in a world where power was often wielded without accountability. His journey had shown that sometimes, when the odds are stacked against you, the greatest weapon you possess is your unwavering resolve to stand up for what is right. As the courthouse doors closed behind him, the memory of that day would live on in the hearts and minds of all who had witnessed it. For those who had doubted him, Jared's victory served as a powerful reminder that even the most unassuming individuals could challenge the might of corporate giants and bureaucratic indifference. And for those who had been quietly rooting for him from the gallery, his success was a beacon of hope. a testament to the idea that every battle, no matter how small it might seem, was worth fighting if it meant reclaiming one's dignity and preserving the sanctity of one's home. In the days that followed, whispers about the trial began to spread far beyond the confines of the courthouse. Neighbors, community leaders, and even local media outlets took note of the David versus Goliath battle that had unfolded that afternoon. Headlines appeared in local newspapers praising the unlikely hero, while social media buzzed with discussions about the importance of standing up to injustice. Jared's story resonated deeply with anyone who had ever felt marginalized or dismissed by a system that seemed to favor the powerful. It was a story of perseverance, courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth. A narrative that reminded everyone that real change often begins with one brave individual willing to defy the odds. For Jared, however, the fight was not over. Though his grandmother's home had been saved, he knew that the battle against corporate exploitation was far from complete. He began to receive letters and calls from people who had been affected by similar practices, each one sharing their own tale of loss and struggle. With every new case that came his way, Jared's resolve grew stronger. He dedicated himself to studying the intricate details of property law, foreclosure procedures, and the legal loopholes that allowed institutions to operate with impunity. Late into the night, he would pore over documents, case files, and statutes, determined to arm himself with every piece of knowledge he could gather. In his modest study, surrounded by stacks of legal texts and scribbled notes, Jared forged a plan, a vision for a future in which justice was not a privilege reserved for the wealthy, but a right guaranteed to every person. As his reputation grew, so too did the community's faith in him. Neighbors began to refer to him not as a mere layman, but as a symbol of resistance, a living testament to the power of perseverance. In quiet conversations at local diners and community centers, people spoke of the day when Jared Calloway had stood up in a courtroom and turned the tide of a seemingly hopeless battle. They marveled at his calm demeanor in the face of ridicule, his relentless pursuit of evidence, and the unyielding spirit that had ultimately led to his triumph. His success was a call to arms for all those who had ever felt marginalized by a system that seemed designed to crush the individual spirit. Yet, even as accolades and words of encouragement poured in, Jared remained humble. He never forgot the long hours of research, the countless documents reviewed, and the personal sacrifices he had made along the way. He knew that his journey was not solely about reclaiming a piece of property. It was about challenging an entrenched system of power and reclaiming dignity for those who had been rendered voiceless. Every step he took, every case he won, added another layer to his personal legacy. A legacy that would inspire others to question authority and demand fairness in every aspect of life. In time, the legal community began to take note of Jared's unconventional methods. Law professors and practicing attorneys alike would occasionally mention his name in discussions about legal ethics and the importance of thorough discovery. His approach, though unorthodox, reminded everyone that the letter of the law was meant to serve the people, not to be exploited as a tool for corporate gain. And while some in the legal establishment scoffed at the idea of a self-taught advocate making such a profound impact, there was no denying the power of his resolve. In the end, his actions resonated far beyond the confines of that one courtroom. On a cool evening several weeks later, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky blazed with hues of crimson and gold, Jared found himself standing outside the very home he had fought so hard to protect. The old, weathered structure stood as a silent witness to the battle waged within the courthouse, a tangible reminder of the lengths he had gone to preserve what was rightfully his. In that quiet moment, as he looked up at the familiar facade, he recalled the doubters and naysayers who had once laughed at him. Their voices seemed to echo faintly against the backdrop of a now peaceful neighborhood. But Jared knew that true victory was not measured in the absence of opposition. It was defined by the courage to rise in spite of it. The memory of that day in court continued to inspire him as he began to share his experiences with others. In small community meetings and local gatherings, he would recount the details of the trial with a measured passion. He explained how every document, every piece of evidence, and every witness had played a role in overturning an injustice. His narrative was delivered with the same steady determination he had shown in the courtroom, and it resonated with everyone who listened. People were not only moved by the legal triumph, but also by the deeper message that power does not reside solely in wealth or titles. It lies with those who dare to stand up for what is right. In time, Jared's story became more than just a personal victory. It evolved into a symbol of hope for an entire community. Neighbors began to rally around him, sharing their own stories of hardship and the ways in which they had struggled against larger forces. They organized meetings, formed local committees, and even started small legal aid initiatives to help others who found themselves entangled in similar disputes. For many, Jared Calloway was not merely a man who had saved his grandmother's home. He was a beacon of resilience, a living example of the idea that even the most underestimated among us could effect meaningful change. As the months turned into years, the echoes of that fateful courtroom battle continued to reverberate. Local media outlets, once skeptical of his methods, now featured his story as an emblem of grassroots justice. In interviews, Jared would modestly downplay his role, insisting that the victory belonged to everyone who had ever been pushed to the margins. Yet, in the quiet of his study, as he revisited old case files and reflected on the journey that had brought him to that moment, he couldn't help but smile. He knew that he had set in motion a series of events that would ripple outward, challenging the status quo and inspiring others to fight back against injustice. Even as he found himself invited to speak at community centers and local schools, Jared never lost sight of his core belief that every individual, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, held within them the power to change the world. His message was simple yet profound. Never allow yourself to be dismissed or underestimated, for it is precisely in those moments that the strength to stand up and fight can emerge. And so, as he continued to advocate for fairness and transparency in all matters of public concern, Jared's story served as a reminder that true power belongs to those who refuse to back down. On that transformative day, as the gavel had fallen and the judge's verdict echoed through the halls of the courthouse, a quiet revolution had begun. The established order had been challenged, and in doing so had left an indelible mark on everyone present. Jared Calloway's journey was far from over, but that day would always be remembered as the moment when one determined soul proved that justice was not the preserve of the mighty, but the right of every individual who dared to stand up and speak the truth. And so, as twilight gave way to night and the stars emerged overhead, Jared walked away from the courthouse with a sense of purpose that transcended the outcome of a single trial. His grandmother's home was safe, yes, but more importantly, he had ignited a spark that would encourage others to question, to fight, and to demand accountability from those who wielded power without regard for human dignity. In that spark lay the hope of a brighter future, one in which every voice could be heard and every injustice challenged. Even now, as the memories of that day remain vivid in the minds of those who were there, the message is clear. The underestimated are often the ones with the most to prove. They may be dismissed and ridiculed at first, but when given the opportunity, they can transform the course of events and alter the fabric of society itself. For Jared Calloway, his battle in the courtroom was not merely about saving a home, it was about upending a system that had long taken advantage of the vulnerable. His victory was a testament to the enduring power of perseverance and the unwavering belief that, in the end, justice will prevail. In the end, it was not the polished suits or the practiced rhetoric that determined the outcome of that case. It was the determination of a single man who refused to accept the status quo.